Growing up, favoritism wasn't just a feeling, it was a fact. It was in the way my parents, Dennis and Diane, would look at Sharon, my older sister, like she hung the stars in the sky, while I was expected to hold the world together for everyone else. It was in the way Olivia and Rachel, my younger sisters, were given little leeway because they were still just kids, while I was pushed into responsibilities I never signed up for. Sharon was the golden child, the pride of the family. She could do no wrong. If she made a mistake, it was shrugged off. If I so much as forgot to wash a dish, I'd get a lecture about how I needed to be more like her. Sharon is so responsible, my mother would say with admiration, despite the fact that I was the one helping with dinner while Sharon sat on the couch texting. My father, too, never held back his praise. You know, Julie, you should learn from your sister. She has a way of making things work in her favor. Oh, I learned all right. I learned that in this family, love was conditional. It wasn't just the small things. It was the holidays where Sharon got the biggest, most expensive presents while I received practical things, socks, school supplies, a planner, as if my only role in life was to be responsible. It was in the way she got the newest phone without asking, while I had to justify why I needed one for schoolwork. It was in the way my achievements were merely acknowledged, while hers were celebrated. I remember when I won a regional essay competition in high school. I had spent weeks researching, writing, and rewriting, determined to make my mark. When I finally won, my teacher was thrilled. "You have such a talent for words," she said, beaming as she handed me the award. I rushed home, eager to share the news. But before I could even open my mouth, my parents were already gushing over Sharon's latest triumph. She had been chosen as the lead in a local theater production. "Isn't that wonderful?" my mother said, hugging Sharon tightly. I stood there, my award clutched in my hands, the words forming but never spoken. No one noticed. By the time I was a teenager, I had stopped expecting fairness. Instead, I threw myself into my studies, determined to carve out a life beyond the confines of our home. I got a part-time job to save money for college, while Sharon never had to lift a finger for anything. She got a brand new car for her 16th birthday. I got the keys to the old family sedan, told that I should be grateful I had anything at all. I learned to be independent, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. It wasn't that I hated my family. I loved Olivia and Rachel dearly. They were still young, still caught between knowing and not knowing the full truth of our household dynamics. I didn't blame them. And my parents? I longed for their approval, but I had long since given up on the hope of ever truly receiving it. I watched as Sharon basked in her privilege, never lifting a hand to help, never having to struggle for anything. She was effortlessly adored, effortlessly given every advantage. Meanwhile, I had to fight for everything. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what it would be like to be the favorite, to be the one whose achievements mattered. I imagined my parents looking at me with the same pride they showed Sharon. But I knew better. By the time I left for college, I was relieved. Finally, a chance to breathe. To exist outside of Sharon's shadow. But even as I built my own future, there was always a part of me that wondered, what would it take for them to finally see me? Not as an afterthought. Not as the one who was just responsible, but as someone who mattered. I never imagined that one day, I'd find out in the most unexpected way possible. For the first time in my life, I wasn't Julie, the forgotten middle child, the backup plan, the dependable one who never needed attention. I was just Julie, a young woman with ambition, drive, and a future that belonged solely to me. College was my fresh start. I threw myself into my studies, determined to prove that I was more than the role my family had cast me in. I worked part-time to support myself, juggling classes and shifts with precision, because I had no safety net to fall back on. Sharon, on the other hand, still lived at home, taking her time with life, never in a rush to be responsible. My parents didn't pressure her, they never would. Responsibility was my burden, never hers. But I didn't care anymore. I was carving out my own path, and it was paying off. After graduating with a finance degree, I landed a job in the city, a prestigious firm where my hard work was finally recognized. I wasn't just existing in someone's shadow anymore, I was making a name for myself. My life was structured, fulfilling, and mine. The distance from my family gave me clarity. For the first time, I saw them for who they truly were. Not just as my parents and sisters, but as people with their own flaws, biases, and decisions. And I realized that no matter how much I succeeded, no matter how far I went, I would never be their priority. And yet, despite everything, when the opportunity came to return home, I didn't hesitate. It started with a promotion, a career-changing offer from my company. They were expanding into my hometown and wanted me to lead a new branch. A step up, a raise, a chance to be closer to the family I had spent years trying to detach from. I hesitated for only a moment before accepting. Maybe things had changed. Maybe the time apart had made my parents see me differently. I packed my things, ready for a new chapter, one that would bring me back to the place I once felt invisible in. The day I arrived back in town, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. My parents welcomed me home with warm smiles, but it was hard to ignore the way they still hovered around Sharon. She hadn't changed. At 28, she still lived at home, still coddled, still somehow the center of attention despite doing nothing to earn it. She gave me a half-hearted hug when I walked in, barely acknowledging my presence before flitting off to another conversation about herself. Olivia and Rachel, now in their late teens, were different. They were happy to see me, eager to ask about my job, my apartment, my life in the city. It was refreshing to be around them, to see the way they admired my independence. But the warmth didn't last long. As the days passed, it became painfully obvious that nothing had changed. My parents still saw me as the one who could take care of herself, meaning I was the one who needed the least attention. Sharon was still their shining star, the one whose every minor achievement was met with exaggerated praise. And then, there was Ryan. I met him a week after moving back, a dinner at my parents' house, where Sharon introduced him with a dazzling smile and a tone that practically screamed, "Look what I've managed to catch." Ryan was everything I despised in a person. Wealthy, arrogant, and condescending, he walked into the house as if he were gracing us with his presence rather than being invited as a guest. He barely looked at my parents when they greeted him, instead glancing around with thinly veiled disdain, like he was inspecting a home he wouldn't even consider buying. "Well," he said, sitting down at the dining table with a smirk, "this is cozy." I saw the flicker of discomfort on my mother's face, but she quickly covered it with an eager smile. My father laughed nervously. Sharon, oblivious as ever, giggled like he had just said the most charming thing in the world. Dinner was excruciating. Ryan spent most of the meal boasting about his father's company, his investments, his future plans. He barely acknowledged Olivia and Rachel, only speaking to Sharon and, occasionally, my parents when he needed something. When he finally turned his attention to me, it wasn't curiosity, it was scrutiny. "So, Julie," he said, swirling the wine in his glass like he was some kind of aristocrat, "Sharon tells me you work in finance. You must be doing well for yourself." I didn't like the way he said it, like he was assessing my worth, deciding whether I measured up to his standards. "I do well enough," I said simply, not offering him the satisfaction of more. "Good, good," he mused. "It's nice to have a successful sibling. You know, Sharon's been lucky to have parents who support her dreams. Not everyone has that." I felt my jaw tighten. The implication was clear. "Some of us didn't have the luxury of relying on our parents," I said, my voice even. Ryan chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Well, I suppose everyone plays the cards they're dealt," he said, flashing me a smirk. I hated him. It wasn't just his arrogance. It was the way he carried himself, the way he looked down on our family like we were some charity case he had to tolerate. And what bothered me most was that my parents, who had always been so obsessed with appearances and respectability, were letting him get away with it. As if they were afraid of him. It wasn't until later that I understood why. Ryan's father owned the company Sharon worked for. That was the real reason my parents were willing to overlook his condescension, his sneers, his blatant disrespect. They needed him. Or rather, they needed Sharon to stay in his good graces. It was a bitter pill to swallow. I had spent my whole life trying to earn their respect, their approval, their pride. And yet, they had never once defended me, never once stood up for me when I was overlooked, dismissed, cast aside. But they would bow to Ryan. Because, in their eyes, he was important. Because he held power. Because he had money. And it disgusted me. I should have known then that my return home wasn't going to be the fresh start I had hoped for. I should have realized that no matter how much I had grown, how much I had achieved, my place in this family had already been decided long ago. I was still the one who didn't matter. But if they thought I was going to stand by and let them treat me like an afterthought again, they were wrong. This time, I was ready. They just didn't know it yet. From the moment he stepped into our home, he carried himself like he was royalty, as if gracing us with his presence was some kind of charitable act. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but the way my parents tiptoed around him, their desperate attempts to stay in his good graces, made it painfully clear this wasn't just about Sharon's relationship. This was about control. And Ryan had all of it. It wasn't until later that evening, after dinner had been cleared and everyone was settling into conversation, that I truly saw the extent of his arrogance. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed lazily over his chest, scanning the living room like he was appraising a property. His gaze landed on the old family photos on the mantel, pictures of childhood birthdays, graduations, family vacations. He smirked, shaking his head slightly. "This place has character," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. My father forced a laugh, like he was in on some joke the rest of us weren't. "It's been home for a long time," he said, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. Ryan nodded slowly, then turned to Sharon. "We're going to need something bigger than this when we start a family," he said, like he was discussing a business deal rather than a future with my sister. "Something modern. Maybe by the lake." My mother, ever eager to please, perked up. "Oh, that sounds lovely." Sharon, of course, beamed. She was practically glowing under his attention, the same way she always had when she got what she wanted. I watched her, wondering if she even noticed how he talked about her, how she was just another piece of his carefully curated life, something to be improved, molded, displayed. And then, as if he hadn't already made his feelings clear, Ryan turned his attention to my youngest sister, Rachel. She was sitting quietly on the couch, playing with the hem of her sweater, an old, hand-me-down piece that had belonged to me years ago. Ryan frowned. "Sharon, remind me later, we need to take Rachel shopping before the wedding." Rachel's head snapped up, eyes wide. "Why?" Ryan chuckled, as if she had just asked the most ridiculous question in the world. "Because we can't have you wearing something like that." He gestured vaguely at her sweater, then glanced at Olivia. "Both of you, actually. We'll get you something more appropriate." Something burned in my chest. Rachel's face turned red, her fingers gripping the fabric of her sleeves. Olivia's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. I set my glass down with deliberate slowness. "There's nothing wrong with what she's wearing," I said, my voice calm but firm. Ryan looked at me, amused. "Julie, come on. I'm just saying, for the wedding, they should look the part. First impressions matter." "And what part is that, exactly?" I asked. He shrugged. "Like they belong." Silence fell over the room. I glanced at my parents, waiting for them to say something, to defend their own daughters. But my mother only gave a nervous chuckle, casting a quick glance at Sharon, as if looking for approval before speaking. My father cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. And then there was Sharon. Instead of defending her sisters, she simply placed a hand on Ryan's arm, tilting her head slightly as she smiled. "Babe, you don't have to say it like that," she said, giggling. "But he's right, you guys. It's a big event. We should all look our best." The casual way she dismissed them, her own sisters, set something off inside me. "You mean look expensive," I said, staring straight at Ryan. He smirked. "That's one way to put it." I didn't realize I had stood up until I saw the way Olivia and Rachel looked at me, their eyes wide with something that looked like both relief and hope. Like they had been waiting for someone to push back. I turned to Sharon. And you're fine with this? Sharon blinked as if she didn't understand why I was making a big deal out of it. Julie, he's just trying to help. Help? I laughed, shaking my head. By telling Rachel and Olivia that they aren't good enough the way they are? Ryan sighed, clearly bored. Julie, don't be dramatic. I turned back to him. You're right. I'm not being dramatic enough. Because the fact that you think you can walk into our home and insult my sisters like this is ridiculous. My father finally decided to speak. Julie, that's enough. I glanced at him, then at my mother, who looked thoroughly uncomfortable but still unwilling to challenge Ryan. It was clear they weren't going to stand up for Olivia or Rachel. And they certainly weren't going to stand up to Ryan. I exhaled slowly. You know what? I think I've had enough of this conversation. And with that, I turned and walked out. I could hear Sharon calling my name, but I didn't stop. I grabbed my coat from the entryway, pushing open the front door and stepping into the cool night air. The moment the door shut behind me, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. How had I ever thought coming back home was a good idea? Later that night, Olivia and Rachel knocked on my apartment door. I opened it to find them standing there, both of them looking hesitant but determined. Can we come in? Rachel asked. I stepped aside, letting them in. They sat on the couch, their hands folded in their laps. I just wanted to say thank you, Olivia said after a long pause. For what you did earlier. Rachel nodded. No one ever stands up to Ryan. Not even Mom and Dad. I sighed, rubbing my temple. That's the problem. He knows they won't stop him, so he just does whatever he wants. Rachel bit her lip. And Sharon lets him. I looked at her, really looked at her. She was only 16, but she had already learned a lesson I had spent years learning. Our parents would never see us the way they saw Sharon. And Sharon would always choose herself over anyone else. She does, I agreed. Olivia exhaled. And it's only going to get worse when they get married. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment. Then we do something about it. They both looked at me, confused. I opened my eyes. We stop letting them think they can walk all over us. Rachel frowned. How? A slow, determined smile formed on my lips. We start by making sure Ryan doesn't get everything he wants. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the responsible one who quietly accepted things. I wasn't going to be the one they ignored, the one they pushed aside. Ryan thought he could waltz into our family and dictate how things worked. He was about to learn otherwise. The wedding was fast approaching, and with it came an increasing number of demands, not from Sharon, but from Ryan. He had seamlessly taken control of the entire event, treating my family as if they were merely accessories to his grand vision. My parents, true to form, bent to his every whim, eager to impress him, eager to remain in his good graces. But then came the demand that changed everything. I was at my apartment when my mother called, her voice carrying that careful tone she used when she was about to ask for something she knew I wouldn't like. Julie, sweetheart, she began. Do you have a moment? I leaned back against the couch, already bracing myself. Sure, what's going on? Well, we were all talking, and Sharon's wedding is such a special occasion. It's going to be the biggest event of her life, and we just want to make sure it's perfect. I sighed. Mom, just say it. She hesitated, and that was all the confirmation I needed that this was about to be ridiculous. Ryan and Sharon were wondering if you could contribute to the wedding fund, she said carefully. I frowned. Contribute how? $15,000, she said, as if it were nothing. I laughed. Actually laughed. Excuse me? I asked, waiting for the punchline. But there was no laughter on her end. You have a good job, sweetheart, she said. You're doing well for yourself. Ryan just thought, well, he suggested it would be a generous gesture, After all, this is your sister's wedding. It's a once-in-a-lifetime event. I sat up straight. Ryan suggested it? He just thought it would be nice, she rushed to say. And, well, we agree. You make good money, Julie. It's not like it would hurt you. I felt my pulse quicken. So let me get this straight. Ryan, the guy who makes more money than all of us combined, is asking me to pay $15,000 for a wedding that isn't mine? There was a long pause. Julie, my father's voice suddenly cut in. He had taken the phone from my mother. It's not just about the money. It's about family. Sharon is your sister. Don't you want her to have the best? I clenched my jaw. If Sharon wants the best, she can pay for it herself. Or Ryan can, since he's the one marrying her. Julie, my mother pleaded, it would mean a lot to us. I let out a slow breath, reining in my temper. No. Another pause. Then my father's voice dropped into something colder. You're being selfish. I almost laughed again, but this time, there was no humor in it. I'm being selfish? Are you hearing yourselves right now? Julie, think about what you're doing, he warned. Think about how this will look. Oh, I had thought about it. And the more I did, the angrier I got. Here's how it looks, I said firmly. Ryan and Sharon want an extravagant wedding, and instead of paying for it themselves, they're trying to guilt me into covering a portion of it because, what? I worked hard and built a successful life. You know what's actually selfish? Expecting someone else to finance your wedding because you don't want to use your own money. I could hear my father's irritation growing. Julie, if you don't contribute, you'll regret it. I let out a sharp breath. No, Dad. The only thing I regret is thinking things had changed around here. I hung up. I expected there to be fallout from my refusal, but even I wasn't prepared for how quickly it escalated. The next day, Sharon called, her tone sharper than I had ever heard it. Julie, what the hell is wrong with you? I pinched the bridge of my nose. Let me guess. Mom and Dad called you. Of course they did. They told me you won't help with the wedding. Do you know how humiliating that is? I let out a humorless laugh. Oh, I'm sorry. Is it humiliating that your fiancé is begging your sister for money instead of paying for his own wedding? Ryan wasn't begging, she snapped. He just thought it would be a nice gesture from you. You make good money, Julie. 15,000 isn't even a big deal for you. I rolled my eyes. If it's not a big deal, then you and Ryan shouldn't have any problem paying for it yourselves. You don't understand, she said, exasperated. This wedding is important. Ryan's family is going to be there. It needs to be perfect. Then make it perfect, I said. With your own money. She scoffed. You know, I always knew you were bitter, but this is low. You're just jealous because I have a fiancé and you don't. That's what this is about, isn't it? I blinked. Wow, that's the best you've got. You're being petty, she accused. You're trying to ruin my wedding because you're unhappy with your life. I stared at the ceiling, trying to stay calm. Sharon, let me make this clear, I don't care about your wedding. I don't care about Ryan. I don't care about any of this. What I do care about is not being treated like an ATM. My answer is no. End of discussion. She made an angry noise, something between a scoff and a growl. Fine, she snapped. But don't expect an invitation. I smirked. Oh no. However will I recover? The line went dead. It didn't end there. The following week, my parents tried again, this time in person. They showed up at my apartment, my mother looking tired, my father looking furious. Julie, my mother started gently, let's talk about this. I crossed my arms. We already did. My father's expression hardened. You are being ungrateful, he said. You're turning your back on this family. My patience snapped. I am being ungrateful? I repeated, incredulous. I spent my whole life trying to earn your approval. I worked hard, I became successful, I did everything on my own. And the first time you actually acknowledge my success, it's because you want money from me? That's not family. That's manipulation. My mother winced. Julie, that's not fair. No, I interrupted. What's not fair is how you've treated me my entire life. You have bent over backwards for Sharon, given her everything, and the one time I say no, suddenly I'm the villain. My father's jaw tightened. We're asking for one thing, Julie. And I said no, I said simply. There was a long, tense silence. Then my father exhaled through his nose. Fine, he said stiffly. But mark my words, you'll regret this. They left without another word. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the forgotten middle child. I felt powerful, because I had just done something I had never done before. I had stood up for myself. And I wasn't done yet. The wedding day arrived sooner than expected, but not for me. For me, it was just another Saturday. I had made my decision, and despite the threats, guilt trips, and insults hurled my way in the past few weeks, I didn't waver. I had never been more certain about anything in my life. I wasn't paying for their wedding. And apparently, because of that, I wasn't allowed to attend. I wasn't even surprised when I got the message. It came from Sharon the night before the ceremony, short and to the point. Since you've made it clear you don't support me, you're not welcome at my wedding. Stay away. There was no, I wish things were different, or maybe we can talk about this later. Just a flat-out command. A final declaration that, in her eyes, I was no longer part of this family unless I was of financial use to her. I stared at the message for a moment, waiting to feel something. Hurt, anger, regret, anything. But there was nothing. Maybe I had already mourned the idea of being part of this family a long time ago. Still, out of curiosity, I decided to go to the venue, not to cause a scene, not to argue, but because I wanted to see just how far my parents had fallen in their desperate attempt to keep Sharon and Ryan happy. The wedding was being held at an upscale country club, the kind of place Sharon had dreamed about since she was a teenager. When I arrived, I parked in the lot and stepped out, taking in the grand entrance, the rows of luxury cars, the immaculately dressed guests moving toward the lavishly decorated entrance. I wasn't dressed for a wedding. I wasn't planning to stay. I just wanted to see for myself what my parents had been willing to sacrifice me for. I made it halfway to the entrance when I was stopped. A large, suited man stepped in front of me, his stance firm but professional. Name? I raised an eyebrow. Julie. He glanced at a list in his hand, then shook his head. You're not on the guest list. I almost laughed. They actually went through the trouble of hiring security to keep me out. I crossed my arms. Let me guess, Ryan's orders? The guard didn't answer, but I didn't need him to. That's fine, I said, stepping back. Enjoy the show. I turned and walked away, my steps light, my heart steady. They had made their choice. Now, I was going to make mine. I spent the rest of the day doing something I hadn't done in a long time, relaxing. I ordered takeout, put on a movie, and for the first time in weeks, let myself breathe. There was something freeing about it, about knowing that I had finally broken free from the expectations that had chained me for so long. No more begging for approval. No more proving my worth. No more sacrificing myself for people who wouldn't do the same for me. But that freedom came with a realization. I didn't owe them anything. And that included my silence. The wedding reception was still in full swing when Sharon and Ryan returned to my parents' house later that night. They were expecting a warm homecoming, a place to celebrate their new marriage, to bask in their victory. Instead, they found all their belongings, clothes, furniture, wedding gifts, dumped in the garbage outside the house. The locks had been changed. Their parents stood in shock, staring at the house that was no longer theirs. And then a neighbor approached, holding a letter. It was from me. Sharon snatched it from his hands, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the paper. Dear family, since you were too busy choosing money over your own daughter, you didn't notice what I was doing. You didn't notice that while you were planning a wedding you couldn't afford, I was making moves of my own. I bought the house. Not with your money. With mine. The money you said I should be using for Sharon's wedding. I may not have given you $15,000, but I gave you something better, a reality check. Since you love Ryan so much, I'm sure he'll be happy to find you a new place to live. Best of luck. Julie. Silence stretched between them as realization set in. The house, the one they had lived in for decades, the one they had used as a weapon against me, was no longer theirs. It was mine. And they were out. Sharon and Ryan stood frozen outside the house, their stunned silence stretching into the night. The wedding had been a grand success, or so they thought. The reception had been an extravagant display of wealth, laughter, and indulgence, everything Ryan had insisted it should be. But their perfect night had ended here, in the driveway, staring at their possessions scattered in garbage bags and the locked door of what was no longer their home. My parents weren't faring much better. My father was gripping the letter so tightly his knuckles had turned white, his eyes scanning the words over and over again as if the meaning would change the more he read them. My mother covered her mouth with a trembling hand, eyes darting from the house to me in disbelief. Because, of course, I was there. Standing by my car, arms crossed, I watched the entire scene unfold. I wanted to see their faces when the reality of the situation finally hit them. I wanted them to feel, for the first time, what it was like to have their security stripped away. Sharon finally found her voice. "You're lying," she spat, her tone dripping with disbelief and rage. "You didn't buy the house. You can't do that." I tilted my head. "I think the locks and the eviction notice say otherwise." Ryan, who had remained shockingly quiet until now, finally stepped forward, his anger barely contained beneath his composed exterior. "You think this is funny?" he demanded. "What kind of sick stunt is this?" I sighed, pretending to think. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe the kind where you learn a lesson about not treating people like ATM machines?" He scoffed. "You really expect us to believe that you just, what? Went out and bought the house?" I shrugged. "That's exactly what I did. I checked the public records, saw the house was still under my parents' mortgage, and made an offer. Unlike some people, I don't spend all my money on extravagant weddings and designer nonsense. I had the funds, so I bought it." My father's face darkened. "You went behind our backs?" I raised an eyebrow. "You went behind mine first. You were willing to cut me out over 15 grand. I just returned the favor on a larger scale." Sharon was shaking now, her fury bubbling over. "You can't do this to me." "To you," I repeated, laughing coldly. "You mean the sister who banned me from her wedding? The sister who stood by while her fiancé insulted our family? You mean the parents who only called me when they wanted money?" "No, Sharon. I didn't do anything to you. You did this to yourselves." Ryan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous. You think you've won, but all you did was make yourself look petty." I smiled. "Oh, Ryan, this isn't about winning. It's about setting boundaries. Something you and my parents clearly never learned how to respect." My father threw the letter to the ground, his patience finally snapping. "You think you can just turn your back on your family like this?" I stared at him, unblinking. "Funny. That's exactly what you did to me first." The weight of my words settled over them, and for the first time, there was no immediate comeback. Just silence. Sharon, however, was never one to accept consequences gracefully. She stormed toward me, her veil still partially clipped into her perfect blonde waves, her expensive gown now dragging across the driveway. "You think this makes you better than me?" she hissed. "You're still just the bitter middle child, Julie. You've always been jealous of me." I sighed. "Jealous? Of what, exactly? Your entitled attitude? Your reliance on men to fund your lifestyle? Your inability to handle rejection?" "No, Sharon. I'm not jealous. I'm relieved." Her eyes narrowed. "Relieved?" "Relieved that I don't have to pretend anymore," I said simply. "Relieved that I finally see all of you for what you are." Ryan scoffed again, shoving his hands into his pockets. "So what? You just expect your parents to be homeless now." I sighed dramatically. "Oh no, however will they survive? Maybe you should help them out, since you're so rich and generous." Ryan's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't like that. Not one bit. Sharon's face contorted with fury, but she wasn't used to being on the losing end. She wasn't used to losing, period. And she certainly wasn't used to me being the one holding the power. "This isn't over," she seethed. I smirked. "Oh, I think it is." With that, I turned on my heel and walked toward my car. I had spent my whole life playing the responsible daughter, the one who never rocked the boat, who always kept the peace even when it meant sacrificing myself. But tonight, I had broken free from that role. And I had never felt lighter. The aftermath was nothing short of glorious. Sharon and Ryan had to scramble to find a new place to stay, but considering Ryan's family wasn't exactly thrilled about his involvement in what they called family drama, their options were limited. They eventually moved into a small condo, not the lakefront mansion Ryan had envisioned. My parents, who had spent years bending over backward for Sharon, found themselves at her mercy for the first time. And for once, she didn't have the power to fix things. They had placed all their bets on her, on Ryan, and now they had nothing to show for it. And me? I moved into the house. Not because I needed to. Not because I wanted to gloat. But because Olivia and Rachel still needed a home. The only ones who had truly supported me, who had seen me for who I was, were my youngest sisters. And unlike our parents, unlike Sharon, I wasn't going to turn my back on them. They moved in with me, and together, we started fresh. For the first time, we had a home that wasn't built on favoritism, manipulation, or conditions. And it was beautiful. A few weeks after everything settled, I received a text from my father. "Julie, let's talk. We're still family." I stared at the message for a long time. And then, finally, I responded. "We were family. Until you decided that money mattered more than I did. Take care." And with that, I blocked his number. Because I was finally done. They thought they could extort me for 15 grand. Instead, they lost everything. And I finally won. Sharon, Ryan, and my parents had spent years believing that power and money were the only things that mattered. That if you controlled the narrative, if you controlled people, you controlled everything. But what they never understood, what they never even considered, was that the foundation they had built their lives on was weak. And when it finally crumbled, there was no one left to help them. Sharon and Ryan scrambled to find a new place to stay. Ryan, for all his arrogance and wealth, wasn't as untouchable as he wanted people to believe. His father, the true holder of power in their world, wasn't pleased about the public embarrassment Sharon and Ryan had brought upon the family name. He saw the situation as a stain on their reputation, one that Ryan should have handled better. Instead of coming to their aid, Ryan's father distanced himself, making it clear that they would receive no financial support in fixing their mess. Ryan was livid. I heard about it from Olivia, who still had mutual friends with Sharon. "He's blaming her," Olivia told me one evening as we sat in the living room. "Apparently, he's saying this is all her fault. That if she had just handled you better, none of this would have happened." I wasn't surprised. Ryan had never seen Sharon as an equal partner. She was just another piece of his perfectly curated image. Now that the image was ruined, he was looking for someone to blame. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my tea. "So what's their plan?" Olivia smirked. "They moved into a small condo on the other side of town. Nowhere near as nice as what they were expecting. And Sharon's miserable." I raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Ryan's not exactly being the doting husband she imagined." Olivia nodded. "More like he's making it clear that she has nothing to offer him anymore. Without your parents' house, without their financial support, she's just another woman in his eyes. And you know how he treats people he doesn't think are valuable." Then I smiled. "Yeah, I think I am." And for the first time in my life, it wasn't a lie. Months later, I received one last message from my father. "Julie, we need to talk. Your mother misses you. We can fix this." I stared at it for a long moment, the words almost laughable. There was no "I'm sorry," no acknowledgement of what had happened. No real effort to make amends. Just another attempt to reel me back in. I didn't reply. Instead, I deleted the message. Because I was done. They had made their choice. And so had I. They thought they could extort me for $15,000. Instead, they lost everything. Now, they could beg someone else for handouts, because I was finally free.